Man, thanks for being with us today. What a great worship time we just had, and I'm glad that you are here to be a part of this ongoing series where we're talking about Revolution, Meet the Jesus that changes everything. And we've asked you to engage in this series, not just on weekend services, but there are also lots of other ways you can dive deeper into what we're talking about in this series. One of them is if you miss a weekend, make sure you go back online and you can find the teaching videos from each week that will catch you up. You can watch those and catch up on where we're at. We're basically looking at the life of Jesus from the time he started his public ministry to the time of his crucifixion. We're going to hit that as we get to Easter. So we're just kind of chronologically going through what Jesus did during his public ministry. And if you miss something, they kind of build on each other, and you want to go back and watch those. Specifically, you'll want to go back and watch last week because I crushed it. And one of my best ever. If you missed it, you got to go see it. What we're also doing, though, is we're asking you to engage in things like there's a weekly blog that goes out. You can find that on our website. And there's those Monday night groups. One of those groups on Monday nights, it'll be meeting tomorrow night through February, is talking about our teachings or our series and going into some greater detail, some deeper thoughts of those, and gives you a chance to discuss and talk about them as well. So just encourage you to dive in and be a part of this. Last week, we talked about the Sermon on the Mount. And we talked about how it would have been totally revolutionary and radical for the Jews of the day to hear some of the stuff that Jesus was saying. Excuse me. And we looked at the Sermon on the Mount, which is really a collection of teachings. It wasn't just one sermon he gave. It was kind of his core teachings that he would have repeated over and over to different crowds. And we specifically honed in on one verse, where Jesus came to say that he did not come to abolish or destroy the law and the prophets, the way they had lived up to that point, what we know today as our Old Testament, but to fulfill it. And in a sense, not to destroy it, not to change it, but to bring it to an end, to say it was completed. It had a shelf life. There was an expiration date for living that way, and now there's a new way to live, and now that's the way of love. And if you think that caused some tension, some defensiveness in the Jews who would have heard that, wait till you see what he's going to tell them today, because he's going to kick it up a notch. And we're going to look at Matthew chapter 12 to start with. If you want to get your Bibles out, your Bible apps, whatever you may have, and follow along, you can. I'm just going to let you know, we're going to look at multiple accounts of this in the Gospels, so we're kind of going to be jumping around a little bit, and you can follow on the side screens. But let's jump into what Jesus says next, or where he takes the disciples and the crowd that he's talking to next. Matthew chapter 12 says this: At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. Now when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." And he answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent?" So let's just stop there for a second. So basically, Jesus is walking along with a crowd that includes his disciples, and wherever Jesus went at this point in his ministry, people followed. There was a crowd following because what he was teaching as a rabbi was so revolutionary, so different, that people were intrigued and they wanted to know more. But part of this crowd were not only people that wanted to hear more or learn from his teaching, part of it was the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the old way of living, would follow him around as well, trying to catch him in the act of doing something wrong. And on this day, Jesus and his disciples are walking along, and his disciples get hungry. And they walk past a field where the grain is still on the stalks and it's ripe and it's ready to eat. And so they pick some heads of grain and they pop it in their mouth, start eating. And the Pharisees that are following go, "Gotcha. Caught you breaking the law." Because one of the laws is that you can't work on the Sabbath. And picking grains or heads of grain is considered labor, considered work. And so you just broke the law. We caught you. And Jesus responds, he goes, "Okay, look, hypocrites. Have you not read that in the Old Testament, what we know as the Old Testament, the law and the prophets, remember that time when King David, one of the heroes of your faith, he got hungry one time and he went into the temple, he and his companions, they couldn't find anything else to eat. And so they ate some of the bread that was given as an offering to God. They took what was consecrated to God and ate it. And how about your priests? Like, they work on Sundays, right? They do labor on Sundays, and yet you don't get upset with them because they're working on Sundays. They're breaking the law as well. He basically says, look, you guys are doing this too. And so don't get on my guys for breaking what you say is a law. By the way, it was their interpretation of the law. Because they were hungry and needed something to eat. And then he says something that really kind of hits this point home, hammers it home. We got to jump to Mark's account of this to get this phrase that he says. But he says to them, the people who had tried to catch him, he says, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." The Sabbath was made for, and again, Sabbath, keeping the Sabbath holy, in their interpretation, meaning not working on the Sabbath, was one of the 10 Commandments, right? Remember, Moses goes up on the mountain, he hears from God, and one of those 10 things that he wrote down on the stone tablets was, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. I mean, it's directly from God. This is one of those laws. And Jesus now comes along and he goes, "No, you guys have misunderstood. The Sabbath is for man, not man for the Sabbath." In other words, he's saying, God gave you that law for the good of the people. He didn't give you that law just so that he would have another thing to lord over you and to make you do. He didn't create man so that he would have someone to follow the laws. He created the laws for man. One of the pastors that I listen to from time to time, I love how he says this. He says, it's kind of like parents don't have children, so they have someone to go pick up the toys, right? The toys are for the kids. You have kids because you created toys and now somebody's got to pick them up. And that's what he's basically saying to these leaders of the laws. The Sabbath was made for man. What you've done basically is you've gotten to the point where you think God loves the law more than he loves the people the law was given to. And they would have said, "You're right, that's what we do." They had gotten to that place in their lives where they loved the law more than they loved the people the law was given to. And Jesus was basically saying, if that's where your stance is, you're on the wrong side of what God intended. Now, we still do this today. Some of you could probably tell stories about this. It's very easy, whether you grew up in church or in Christian circles or maybe even another religion, it's very easy for the religion or the things that you're supposed to do become the thing that we love. And I bet if we went around this room, some of you could tell stories of experiences where someone that you knew, or maybe a family member, maybe it was you, got pregnant before you were married, and you were in a church or you were in a group of people in a religion where they separated themselves and said, "Oh, you broke a law. And so now we have to distance ourselves from you." Or maybe you saw what happened when your parents got divorced. And people said, "Oh, the law is so important that we have to stay away from you because you broke a law. And we still do this today. And Jesus comes, he says, no, you got it backwards. The purpose of the law was for man, for what was best for them. And if you think that I love the law more than I love the people, then you're on the wrong side of the law. And this would have been radically different for the people that were hearing this. And then Jesus goes one step further. And back in Matthew 12, if we follow the conversation, he says one more thing. He says, I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. I tell you something greater than the temple is here. Now you and I read this and we go, okay, that's interesting. Something greater than the temple, not a big deal. This would have blown them away. Something greater than the temple. See, the temple was the symbol of their relationship with God. In fact, all throughout the law and the prophets, the Old Testament, the temple was where God's presence actually was. The temple was the center of their social life, their religion. Everything they did revolved around the temple. In fact, the temple over the years was so important. If you remember, the first temple that was built by King Solomon. We've talked about this in past series, where King Solomon poured everything he could into building this first temple for God. He had walls covered with gold. He brought cedar beams down from the hills. I mean, this thing at the time would have been an architectural masterpiece. People would have walked by that and just been amazed and blown away by this temple, because Solomon wanted to give everything he could, hold nothing back for this place where God's presence was and for this symbol of our relationship with God. That first temple eventually gets destroyed, gets torn down. And we've talked before about there's a second temple then that's rebuilt. If you read what we have in our Old Testament as the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, you can read the story about how the Jews who were scattered at the time came back to Jerusalem, and Nehemiah leads them and calls them back and says, we have to rebuild the temple. It is so central to who we are that we have to rebuild it. And they start building the temple again, the second temple, but this time it's simpler. It's a little smaller. They don't have the resources that King Solomon did. If you read the account of this, you'll actually see that there are some people who are working on the second temple who were around to see King Solomon's temple. And it says they weep because they realize that what they're able to build now is nothing compared to what they had before. But they build it anyway because it's so central to their religion. In fact, they would say, if you mess with the temple, you're not just messing with a religion, you're messing with the identity of an entire nation. I mean, this is who we are, the Israelite nation. Part of our DNA is the temple. Trying to think about what that might be like for us here today in our culture. And I don't think this is quite it, but maybe it gets us in that direction. It would be like if I came up here today and said, there is something better for you than the freedom that our forefathers fought and died for. You know, there's something better than that. And you would go, whoa, time out. I mean, that's part of our DNA as a country. That's part of who we are. I mean, I had relatives who died in battle so that you and I could have that freedom. You know, don't just come in and go, oh yeah, there's something better than that. And it's here right now. That's the kind of thing they would have been feeling. I tell you, something better than the temple is here. Let me give you another example of how important the temple and the law that was associated with it was to them. Remember that the Jews live as kind of their own little culture around Jerusalem, within the bigger Roman Empire. Okay, the Roman Empire basically says, we have conquered you, you are subservient to us, but we'll let you kind of live out your own little religion. If you want to have your temple, all that kind of stuff, that's fine. As long as you do what we tell you, you pay us taxes, all that kind of stuff. Well, the Jews throughout all of that time that they were under the Roman Empire were continually revolting, pushing back against that. And there was one particular time where there was a Roman emperor his name was Gaius Caligula. And he was only an emperor for 3 or 4 years, and you can actually go look this up in history. He became the Roman emperor, and he didn't like the fact that the Jews were down there worshiping their God and didn't see him on that same level. He thought he was basically a god. And so he gave an order that a statue of himself should be taken down and put inside the temple walls of the Jews. And he sent this guy, Petronius, with his a legion of soldiers to go with him to go take this statue down and put it in the temple walls. The Jews found out about this, they heard about it, and they meet Petronius at a port city where he's coming down. And it says that 10,000 Jews, many of them from the countryside, and it says they were peasants, came to meet him at this port city. And they basically stood in front of him and said, there is no way we are letting you put that statue in our temple, because that would break one of our laws, one of the laws that God gave, one of the 10 Commandments. It said, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall make no graven images that you bow down and worship to. And it basically says, the picture is, it says that they bare their necks and basically say, you will have to cut off our heads and kill us before we will ever let you put that statue in our temple. That's how much this means to us. Petronius actually gets around them and he goes inland. And when he gets to an inland city, there's even more Jews surrounding him, and basically they put themselves between him and Jerusalem. They tell him, you've got to go through and kill each one of us if you're going to put that statue there. Petronius doesn't know what to do. And so he knows he's kind of signing his own death wish, but he writes a letter back to the emperor and basically says, I know you told me to do this, and I know there's a good chance you're going to kill me because I can't carry out this order. But there's no way for me to put that statue in there without committing genocide, without basically wiping out the nation of Israel, because no one's going to stand and let me do that. And a strange twist of fate, actually, this letter gets back to the emperor, but before there's a response back to Petronius, the emperor's assassinated and killed. And Petronius lets go of the order and goes back to Rome, and it never happens. But that's how important this temple was. They were willing to die for the temple. They were willing to let their nation be wiped out before anybody desecrated the temple. In addition to that, at the time that Jesus is making this statement, you have to understand that it's not this second temple that Nehemiah rebuilt that is the one that's standing. Okay, they lived with that temple for years, that simple temple that didn't hold a candle to Solomon's candle or temple. But about 20 years before Jesus is having this conversation, Herod the Great is ruling in this area, and he wants to get on the good side of the Jewish nation. And so he says, I know the temple you have right now is not what you'd want it to be. What if I helped you restore it to its former glory? So they go through some negotiations, and during Herod's time, they expand and rebuild this second temple. And I want to show you a little bit about what this temple would have looked like when Jesus is talking about it in his day. You see, the original temple was kind of on the top of a mountain, which didn't leave a lot of horizontal space. And so Herod basically doubled the size of what we today call the Temple Mount. And they actually built walls. We've got some pictures here. These are models, but these walls are so tall on the side because they had to build them up and then fill them with earth to get more flat space to put this temple on. In addition to that, they mined all these stones from a quarry and transported them to this place. And some of these stones were huge. There's one on the western wall called the Western Stone. And you can see it here. It is one of the largest construction blocks ever used in history. And to give you an idea how big this is, the stone starts just above where the lady's hand is and goes up to where the smaller blocks are. And it is 45 feet long. This room, just to give you an idea, is 50 feet wide. So it's basically as long as this room is wide, 10 to 12 feet high, 10 to 12 feet thick. One huge block of stone that they would have taken from a quarry and moved and set on this foundation. This is actually beneath the earth. It's in a tunnel. Would have become one of the foundation stones of this new temple. This is amazing. People today still aren't sure exactly how they got it there. Incredible feat of construction and architecture. And solid, right? This is like the bedrock, the core of what they were building this temple on. We're making it earthquake proof, right? Nobody's going to tear down a temple made of a piece of stone that big. In addition, there were huge courtyards, and the temple itself was ornate. This is another model, and you can see the size of this compared to the size of the people. This thing was huge. Can you imagine that sitting on the top of the hill where people from miles around could see it? This is what it looked like in Jesus' time when he goes, something greater than the temple is here. Now, this temple was so magnificent that even the disciples were amazed. There's a story of them walking out of the temple one day. It's in Mark chapter 13. It says, as Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." As many times as they had seen it, it still amazed them. It's the picture I have in my mind is, Jesus and his disciples are at the temple and they're leaving for the day, and Jesus is walking away, and one of the disciples tugs on him and says, hey, Jesus, turn around and look. Just look at that. I mean, isn't that amazing that someone was able to create this thing? I mean, this is the kind of thing that's going to last forever. And here's how Jesus responds. Do you see all these great buildings, replied Jesus? Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. And that word that we interpret as thrown down doesn't mean it'll just fall over. It means it will be taken off and thrown down. And I can imagine the disciples are turning that, looking at it going, Jesus, that's impossible. I mean, look at this thing. It's not going anywhere. What do you mean that this is all just going to go away? In the next verse, it says that they cross the valley and go to the Mountain of Olives. It says, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they are about to be fulfilled? They're basically going, okay, I think this is what you said, Jesus, right? Like, this is all going to go away at some point. And they're sitting on this mountain, and across the valley, they could see up on the hill the entire courtyard. I mean, they had a view of it where they could see the entire thing and how massive it was. They could see the people walking around, and they basically go, so Jesus, you're saying that's all going to be gone? Like, when is that going to happen? How would we know when that's about to happen? And you can read Jesus' response. One of them is in Luke chapter 21. I want to give you just a taste of what he says. He says in Luke 21:20, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. If you read through that whole account, Jesus describes kind of some of the stuff that will happen, and it's almost like Jesus has a sadness in his voice. And he's describing at some point this is all going to go away. And one of the indicators will be when you see the city of Jerusalem surrounded. That's an indicator that it's time to get out and you should flee. Fast forward to the year 66. Jesus has died, been crucified on the cross, resurrected, ascended into heaven. He's not on the earth any longer. This is a few years later. In the year 66, there's some squabbles within the Jewish nation. They're kind of like, honestly, it's like little gangs that pop up and fight among themselves, but then they get together long enough that they revolt against the Romans again. Except this time they go a little too far. And the Romans send down a few legions of soldiers to squelch this revolt. And over the next few years, there's skirmishes back and forth, fighting, killing on both sides, until finally a guy named Titus comes down as a part of this, or he's been a part of it from the beginning, and he starts putting up a wall around Jerusalem to basically keep them all in and keep everything else out. And he builds this wall, but it's not quite finished yet, and they have gates and stuff that they're putting in, and the Passover time comes, and many of the Jews from the surrounding area are coming to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover time. And instead of keeping them out, Titus says, open the gates and let them all in. And then once all of these people are inside, close the gates, and we're not going to let anybody out. We're going to force them to use up all their food that they have quicker than normal because all these extra people are in there. And so they do it, and they use up all the food, and people begin to starve. There's fighting amongst themselves. The history accounts say that the Jews inside fight each other at night and then fight the Roman soldiers during the day. It's just chaos. And eventually, in the year 70, Titus takes his soldiers, and they're able to scale the inner wall. And they go in and they kill everything and everybody that they can't sell into slavery. I want to give you just an excerpt of what that would have looked like from a historian named Josephus, and he's one of the guys that helps us understand the history of this time, not a biblical author. He was actually a Jewish general when this started, and during the skirmishes flipped sides and went over to the Roman side and began helping them figure out how to how to defeat the Jews. And this is his description of that night when the Roman soldiers charge in. It says, as the legions charged in, neither persuasion nor threat could check their impetuosity. Passion alone was in command. Crowded together around the entrances, many of the Jews were trampled by their friends. Many fell among the still hot and smoking ruins of the colonnades and died as miserably as the defeated. Everywhere was slaughter and flight. Most of the victims were peaceful citizens, weak and unarmed, butchered wherever they were caught. Round the altar, the heaps of corpses grew higher and higher, while down the sanctuary steps poured a river of blood, and the bodies of those killed at the top slithered to the bottom. That's the picture of what happened when they came in and just killed everything and everybody. And after that, they burned the temple. They looted it. They actually took the Ark of the Covenant and took it back to Rome. And then they did something amazing. One by one, they tore down every stone of the temple. And they threw them down into the valley below. If you go to Jerusalem today, you can actually see some of these stones still laying in the valley. No stone on top of the Temple Mount above the surface of the foundation was left. They were all thrown down just as Jesus predicted. And on that day, ancient Judaism died. No more sacrifices, no more temple, and no more sacred place or objects or anything that was attributed to that original law. Now, as a side note, this is actually hugely important to us. If you're somebody who has struggled with, is what we know in the Bible really real? Right? Does this really make sense? Do these accounts, are they really accurate? Are they historical? One of the big questions that comes up many times is, were these gospel accounts, so these things that we just read, were they really written by people that would have been around when Jesus was alive? Were they written early enough in history that they're accurate? And this is one of the best pieces of evidence that we have proof that they are. Because remember, I said all this happened. The temple was torn down stone by stone. The stones that you can still see today in the valley around Jerusalem happened in the year 70. Nowhere in the Gospels do any of the writers say, and it happened just like Jesus predicted. What does that mean? The temple was still up. It was still standing when they wrote those words. When they wrote the accounts that we had today, that we just read, when they're talking about Jesus saying that no stone will be left unturned, no stone will be left, the reason they were saying that is because they could look at the temple and it was still standing. So it had to be written before the year 70. It's one of the best pieces of proof that we have that these are accurate accounts written by people who were living during the time that Jesus would have been here on earth. But let me ask you a question. It's a cool story. I love the history of it. Love, looking at what the temple would have been like. But the question for us today is, do you have a temple in your life? What's that thing that might be in your life that you go, I love that so much? Or it's such a part of my identity. Or it's that thing that I would have a hard time believing could ever go away. But it's the thing that's taking the place of something greater in your life. Something better. A relationship with God and a love for his people. Jesus came and he said, something greater, something better than the temple is here. Do you have a temple in your life? Is it a relationship? Maybe it's your kids. Maybe it's someone you're dating. Maybe it's your position, how people look at you, your identity of what people think of you. Maybe it's a job that you're aspiring for. Maybe it's some of the stuff you have in your life. Are those things that you hold on to and they're a part of your identity and they're a part of what you think, man, those things could never go away. Those are a part of me and I'll do anything to keep those. When Jesus would come and say, there's something better than that. All of that stuff is temporary. I don't care how well it's been built. I don't care how cool it looks. I don't care how magnificent the buildings are. It's temporary. It won't last forever. And there's something better. It would have been a radical, upside-down teaching to the Jews. And I think for us today, it could still have that same effect. Let me pray for us. God, I don't know what it is in our lives that might be a temple. May not even have recognized that it was our temple until today, where we stop to think and go, man, that's something I would never give up. That's something that I always assumed would always be there, but it's something that's keeping me from experiencing something better, a relationship with God that is worth everything, and a love for his people. God, if we find those temples in our lives, I pray that you'll just help us to begin to let go of them. And begin to be part of experiencing your better for our lives. In your name we pray.